I found my husband's work phone and destroyed his life. I stood frozen in the dim light of the garage with the cool air hitting my skin and making the hair on my arms stand up because the reality of what I was holding felt heavier than the phone itself. My hands were trembling so violently that I almost dropped the device twice before I could fully process the spreadsheet glowing on the screen. This was not just a betrayal of affection or a simple affair which I could have perhaps understood or processed in a normal way. This was a systematic monetization of my pain. I scrolled through the chat log named the Truman betting pool and felt my stomach churn with a mixture of nausea and absolute horror. The timestamps matched every major emotional crisis I had experienced in the last 5 years. I saw a message from my best friend Sarah dated 3 years ago on the day my cat died. She had bet $200 that I would call out of work for exactly 3 days. I did exactly that. My husband had replied with a thumbs up emoji and confirmed the payout. It was sickening to realize that his comforting hugs that day were not acts of love but the actions of a man securing a winning bet. I need you to stop for a second and ask yourself what you would do in this situation because I truly felt like the ground was dissolving beneath me. If you enjoy these Reddit stories and want to see how I handled this absolute nightmare, then please hit that subscribe button right now because this gets so much worse. I forced myself to keep reading because I needed to know the extent of the damage before I confronted anyone. I found an entry from the week we bought our house. I remember having a panic attack about the mortgage rates and crying on the kitchen floor while my husband made tea. The log showed that he had wagered $500 against my sister that he could trigger a meltdown by mentioning interest rates casually over dinner. He had manipulated me into a state of distress just to win money from my own sibling. My sister had replied that she lost the bet but enjoyed the show. These were the people I spent holidays with and the people I trusted with my deepest insecurities. They were not my support system. They were an audience betting on a blood sport where I was the only participant who did not know the rules. I felt a wave of dizziness hit me as I realized that every fight we ever had was likely staged. Every time he forgot our anniversary or made a passive-aggressive comment about my cooking, it was calculated to yield a specific reaction for the group chat. I saw a thread about my recent job loss. I had been devastated when I was let go from the marketing firm, but now I saw texts between my husband and a contact I did not recognize discussing how to sabotage my presentation. They had actually orchestrated my professional failure to spice up the betting season. I leaned against the cold metal of the car trying to breathe, but the air felt thin. The betrayal was total. It was financial, emotional, and professional. I took screenshots of everything with my own phone and emailed them to a secure account I created years ago for backup storage. My fingers felt numb as I navigated the screen. I had to be fast because he was just inside the house watching television and waiting for me to come back with the cleaning supplies. I wiped the screen of the second phone with the hem of my shirt to remove my fingerprints and slid it back under the passenger seat exactly where I had found it. I looked him dead in the eyes and lied with a smoothness that frightened me. I told him everything was great and that I just found some old receipts. He seemed to relax. That was the moment I realized I could play this game too. I went straight to the bathroom and locked the door behind me. I turned on the shower to create white noise in case he was listening at the door. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone to review the files I had airdropped to myself. I had missed something in my initial panic in the garage. There were folders I had not opened yet. I tapped on a folder labeled production assets, expecting to find more financial logs or betting slips. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was not just about bets and text messages. I saw detailed blueprints of our home, but they were marked with red circles in every single room, including the bathroom I was currently standing in. I slowly lifted my head and looked up at the vent. It looked completely normal with dust gathering on the slats just like any other house. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might bruise the bone. I stood on the edge of the bathtub and carefully peered into the darkness of the grate. There was a tiny glint of glass reflecting the bathroom light. It was a lens. I clamped my hand over my mouth to suppress a scream that clawed at my throat. I was being watched right now. They had footage of me showering, using the restroom, and crying in privacy. The violation was so absolute that I felt physically dirty. I climbed down from the tub and sat on the closed toilet lid, shaking uncontrollably. This was not just a cruel game among friends. This was a felony. This was a coordinated surveillance operation inside my own home. I realized that if I reacted now or tried to dismantle the camera, they would know that I knew. The husband, I could no longer think of him as my partner, would see my discovery in real time if he was monitoring the feed. I had to act normal. I had to finish my shower and go out there and eat dinner with the monster who sold my privacy for cash. I stripped off my clothes and stepped into the water, letting it run over my face to hide the tears that were inevitably falling. I washed my hair mechanically while my mind raced through every intimate moment we had shared in this house. Had they watched us be intimate? The thought made me want to vomit. I walked out of the bathroom and into the bedroom where my husband was now laying on the bed scrolling through his tablet. I wondered if he was watching the replay of me in the shower. He looked up and asked if I was feeling okay because I had been in there for a long time. I told him I just needed to decompress after cleaning out the garage. He watched me closely. It was a look I used to interpret as concern, but now I recognized it as the gaze of a scientist observing a lab rat. He patted the spot next to him on the bed. I sat down and my skin crawled when his hand touched my shoulder. He asked what I wanted for dinner. I told him I was craving Italian. He paused for a fraction of a second. I remembered seeing a bet in the logs earlier that day. My sister had bet $50 I would want sushi. He had bet on Italian. He smiled a genuine smile of victory and said Italian sounded perfect. He had won the bet. I felt a surge of rage so potent it almost blinded me, but I channeled it into a sweet smile. I offered to go downstairs and start boiling the water. I needed to get away from him to check the rest of the files. As I chopped vegetables in the kitchen, I kept my phone propped up behind a cutting board. I needed to see who else was involved. I found a subfolder in the financial ledger titled Subscribers. The list was extensive. It wasn't just my sister and my best friends. There were names of my coworkers, my neighbors, even my cousin who lived in another state. They were all paying a monthly subscription fee to access the premium content of my life. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. I was the main character in a twisted show I never auditioned for. I heard my husband's footsteps coming down the stairs and I quickly swiped the screen to a recipe page. He walked up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. He whispered that he loved me. The lie hung in the air like a toxic cloud. I turned around and kissed him on the cheek while holding a sharp knife in my hand behind my back. I realized I needed to look at the final file. The one labeled the client. I had assumed the client was just a code name for the bank account where the money was pooled. But his reaction suggested the client was a person. A person with significant control. We sat down to eat and I watched him consume the meal I prepared. I analyzed every word he said. He tried to steer the conversation toward my insecurities about my weight. He mentioned that the pasta was heavy in carbs. I knew he was trying to trigger a reaction for the evening spread. Instead of getting upset, I laughed and said I loved my curves. His face fell. He lost money on that interaction. I felt a tiny spark of victory. I was going to bankrupt him. I was going to drain every cent from this sick operation before I sent them all to prison. But first I needed to identify the head of the snake. After dinner I claimed to have a migraine and went to the guest room, which I knew from the blueprints had a blind spot in the corner near the wardrobe. I sat on the floor in the dark, huddled with my phone. I had one final folder to open. The file structure was complex and encrypted, but I had the password because it was the same date as our wedding, a detail that felt like a final knife in my heart. I clicked on the contact card and the phone number was familiar. It was a number I had dialed thousands of times since I was a child. The name associated with the number in the hidden file was Matriarch. It was my mother. The room spun violently. I had to put a hand on the floor to steady myself. My mother. The woman who had comforted me when I cried about my marriage. The woman who told me to be patient with him. The woman who constantly critiqued my appearance and my choices. It all clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. Every time she criticized me, she was directing the plot. She was not just a participant, she was the architect. She had always been obsessed with control and drama. She had turned her own daughter into a soap opera for her entertainment and profit. I opened the chat log between my husband and my mother. The messages were monstrous. One from last Christmas read, "She looks too happy. Ruin the turkey. I put $5,000 on a public breakdown before dessert." My husband had replied, "Consider it done." I remembered that Christmas. The oven had malfunctioned and burned the bird. I had cried in front of the whole family while my mother tooted and told me I was too emotional to run a household. She had engineered my humiliation and then scolded me for it. A rage unlike anything I had ever felt began to boil in my veins. It was cold and sharp and dangerous. They thought I was weak. They thought I was a fragile thing that would break whenever they pushed a button. They were wrong. I was the one holding the evidence now. The blueprints indicated a hidden safe in the basement behind the wine rack. That was where the hard drives were. I waited until the house was silent. It was 2 a.m. My husband was asleep in the master bedroom, likely dreaming of his winnings. I crept out of the guest room, avoiding the floorboards I knew were creaky. I moved like a ghost through the house that had been my prison. I reached the basement door and opened it slowly. The cool air from below smelled of damp earth and expensive wine. I descended the stairs, counting my steps in the dark to avoid tripping. I reached the wine rack and felt for the latch indicated on the blueprints. It clicked softly. The rack swung forward, revealing a steel safe. The code was my birthday. Of course it was. They mocked me even with their security measures. I punched in the numbers and the heavy door swung open. Inside sat a row of hard drives and a stack of cash. I didn't touch the cash. I took the drives. I put them in my hoodie pocket. These drives contained 5 years of illegal surveillance. This was my weapon. I was about to close the safe when the basement lights flooded the room. I spun around, shielding my eyes against the sudden brightness. My husband stood at the top of the stairs holding a baseball bat. His face was not the face of the man I loved. It was a mask of cold indifference. He didn't look surprised. He looked disappointed. He said that the client had bet I would find the safe eventually, but they didn't think it would be this soon. He started walking down the stairs. He told me to hand over the drives and we could discuss a settlement. He spoke as if this was a business transaction. I realized in that moment that my life was truly in danger. If I walked out of here with these drives, their game was over and they would go to jail. He wasn't going to let me leave. The piercing shriek of the alarm system was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was deafening in the enclosed space of the basement. The strobe lights began to flash, creating a chaotic, disjointed effect that disoriented him. He covered his ears and stumbled backward, shouting at me to turn it off. I didn't hesitate. I used the confusion to sprint past him up the stairs. He grabbed at my ankle, but his grip was slippery with sweat and I kicked back hard, connecting with his face. I heard a crunch and a curse, but I didn't look back. I burst through the basement door and ran for the front entrance. The house was flashing with emergency lights. The alarm had automatically alerted the police and the fire department. I knew they would be here in minutes. I ran out the front door and into the cool night air. I didn't stop running until I reached the neighbor's lawn across the street. I saw lights turning on in houses all down the block. I stood there in my pajamas, clutching the hard drives in my pocket, watching my husband stumble out of the front door. He looked frantic. Then she hung up. The police cruisers screeched to a halt in front of our driveway. Officers swarmed the property. I walked toward them calmly. I handed them the hard drives and told them everything. I told them about the cameras, the bets, the money, the psychological torture. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The investigation revealed over 500 terabytes of illegal footage. My husband was arrested that night for unauthorized surveillance, wiretapping, and fraud. My mother was arrested 2 days later at her country club. The evidence on the drives was irrefutable. The subscribers list allowed the FBI to track down every single person who had paid to watch my misery. My sister, my friends, my coworkers, they were all implicated. Many lost their jobs. Some faced charges. My husband and mother are currently awaiting trial and looking at significant prison time. I sued for emotional damages and won a settlement that liquidated my mother's entire estate and my husband's assets. I took every penny they had earned from my pain and millions more. I destroyed their lives completely. I left that town and never looked back. I moved to a city where no one knows my name. I live in a small apartment now. It has no smart devices. No cameras. I check the vents every single day. I sweep the room for bugs once a week. I trust no one. I have no friends. I speak to no family. The silence is heavy sometimes, but it is mine. It is the only thing I own that is truly real. I often wonder if I will ever be able to love again or if I will always look for the camera lens in a lover's eye. They stole my ability to connect with human beings. But I won the final bet. I survived. And they are the ones in a cage now. If you are listening to this and you feel like the people around you are manipulating you, or if your intuition screams that something is wrong, listen to it. Check your vents. Check the phones. Because sometimes the paranoia isn't a sickness. Sometimes it is the only thing keeping you safe from the people who claim to love you.